Hello all, and welcome back to our Stormwater Rule Change discussion. My name is Stefano Viola, and I'm with Kimley Horn Associates. With me today, I have Susan Stevens. Susan is with Stearns, Weaver, and Miller, and has been practicing environmental law for over 30 years, primarily focused on water resource law, and has been handling ERP program issues for the better part of her career. Additionally, Scott Weeks from Kimley Horn. Scott has nearly 20 years of experience successfully designing and delivering complex surface water projects of all sizes for both the public and private sectors, which has required him to be well versed with the local water management districts and their respective water quality criteria. Susan, what are some of the key components of these new requirements?
Well, as we went over in part one of this discussion, the key things are stormwater treatment performance requirements rather than design-based solutions. And again, that's a % reduction in total suspended solids, total nutrients, total nitrogen, and total phosphorus, and a total net improvement standard across most water bodies in the state. And again, there's also operation and maintenance requirements with financial assurance requirements to make sure that once these things are in the ground, they're going to continue to work over the life of the project, which has been a challenging thing that DEP's dealt with in the past. And finally, we have a suite of new treatment options that we'll get into that could provide some significant relief and tools in the toolbox to achieve these new standards.
That makes sense. Scott, what does the new rule mean for projects and their respective stormwater designs?
Right, great question. So with the new nutrient removal standards, what's going to be required is every project, unless they're exempt, has to provide nutrient loading calculations. So pre-development, post-development, and then for whatever type of design the engineer comes up with for the system, for water treatment, it needs to meet those requirements. And so we've got calculations that are going to be needed for the removal efficiency from the water management systems.
And I would note that these treatment options are all going to be additional to the options you're already having to implement, and they're expected to increase the cost by about $2,600 per developed acre. And that's not counting any additional land that you might have to purchase to comply with the new standards or set aside from your development to comply with the new standards. And so to that end, Scott, I have a question for you. Is more land going to be required to comply with these new performance standards?
It certainly might. Each project is different, has its unique situation, circumstances with the watershed and the parameters of the project, and so it very well could require more land. As engineers, what we'll need to do is determine best management practices that are suitable for that project to meet the criteria of that watershed. So across the board, we talked in part one, there's an 80% reduction in total phosphorus that's required. Well, in some systems, there may be no change that's needed. For example, a retention pond may already provide that required level. In that kind of project, maybe no more land would be needed. But for systems that are more focused on wet detention, they can't meet that 80% requirement. The new rule has an appendix with a table of all the different best management practices, such as baffle boxes, wet ponds, dry ponds, all the different tools. But it also has the removal efficiencies that they're going to accept for each of those tools. And so when we talk about wet ponds are capped at 79.9%. So it's just barely under that 80%. But for total nitrogen, the difference is much greater. A wet detention pond by itself is capped at 42% removal for TM. And the minimum requirement for all sites is 55% removal. So it just falls short. And for impaired water bodies, when it jumps to 80% removal and 95% for outstanding Florida waters, you see the difference is quite a bit to make up. Wet ponds by themselves are just not able to meet that requirement, which means something else in addition to wet retention is going to be required. And it's going to be up to the engineer to determine what does that look like, what type of treatment, what type of system.
Now, I've heard that there is a new tool in the toolbox about off-site compensating storage. That sounds like it has a promising potential here to deal with new treatments. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah. So the rule does allow for off-site compensation for water quality requirements. Now, this is a little bit different than regional stormwater systems where, say, a site would discharge to a master pond that's downstream. But what it allows is off-site treatment, meaning another pond that's not necessarily connected to the project, but still provides some sort of treatment for stormwater that's affecting the same watershed, the same basin. So imagine if a site's being developed and there's not enough room on that site to do the treatment that's required. If the same level of treatment can be provided off-site and they both go to the same water body, that would be acceptable.
Well, that seems like it could potentially result in additional land costs. I do know that the rule does require some sort of ownership interest or permission to use that off-site system. But I also understand that one possible solution will be someone developing on the order of a sort of like a mitigation bank using that off-site storage, except it's going to be water quality compensation. So you could essentially buy credits in that. Do you think that's going to be a viable path forward?
I think so. Yeah, there's definitely some, the legislator's been doing some work currently about opening doors for that. And the new rule is written in such a way that allows for that to happen. So the framework is beginning to come in place for that. And we don't know all the details yet, but certainly I could see that happening. It's a more comprehensive approach to water quality management where it's, looking at the total nutrients into one watershed, not just each project individually.
I mean, this is great information. And so with that same thing, talking about costs and the impacts, we've touched about it in part 1, now we'll touch on it in part 2. What are the changes that are required for operation and maintenance?
Right, so the new rule does have enhanced operation and maintenance requirements, including an operation and maintenance plan for every project. And that's going to detail all the key design elements of the project, separate from just the permitted drawings. So the plan will have inspection frequencies, what needs to be checked, how it needs to be checked, and there's certification and training that's required for those inspectors.
And I'd also like to point out that there are also new cost requirements. You need to put a cost estimate of what your O&M expenses are expected to be. And then on top of that, you need to demonstrate there's a financial ability to meet those requirements.
And that's during permitting. That's not later. It's up front. So it's helpful for owners and designers to know how does the system get maintained long term.
Understood. I mean, these are some new changes. We need to be up to date for that. We are talking about water quality, which is important to Florida. What are some of the things that we really need to focus on and key takeaways that we've touched on today?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is going to the question of water quality in Florida. This will enhance water quality in the state of Florida. The stormwater management will result in reductions in loadings across the board for all new projects coming down the pipe.
Yeah, because those requirements affect every project. And so nutrient loading is going to be a necessary thing that we evaluate when we design stormwater systems. We also have a lot of new tools in the toolbox with the new rule that allow us to meet those standards.
And I do think it's important to recognize that this is going to increase the cost of your development. And it's something we need to understand and get comfortable with. We are not entirely sure how that's all going to play out. We talked about additional land costs being a possibility. The off-site compensation storage sounds like it has a lot of promise if these it's available on public lands perhaps, or perhaps becomes sort of like a conservation bank where you buy your water quality credit. All of these hold promise and are going to be important components of the rule going forward.
So we've covered a lot today. It's very detailed and specific information for stormwater quality. If you'd like to know how that's going to impact your project, please reach out to us at Kimley Horn and Stearns Weaver Miller. We're here to help you. Thank you both, Susan and Scott. I think this was great information.
And thank you for joining us.
Thank you all.